Really happy to have you all here and our guests this morning for Uninvited Guests, Invasive Species and the Threat to Ecosystems and Economies. This is organized primarily by Peter Stute, our Canada-U.S. Fulbright Chair for the spring semester here. Peter's a professor of political science at Concordia University in Montreal. And I'm going to turn the program over to Peter. He's going to present and moderate, and he will introduce the others, and I will give that to the moderator. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the others. And you have bios, so in case you're curious, before they're officially introduced, read up. So over to Peter, and enjoy the show.
Thank you, David. Okay. The policy context of the invasive species issue area, to put it broadly. So I'm very happy that Stas Burgiel is here. This is the order that will speak after me, I believe. Stas is Assistant Director for Prevention and Budgetary Coordination, National Invasive Species Council. But he's also done a lot of work with the Nature Conservatory and also with the Global Invasive Species Program, which, as you'll see in my presentation, is no longer with us, but nonetheless was an important part of the puzzle. And Peg Brady, Fisheries Strategic Planning Lead, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, very well-known scientist. And Anouk Simar, who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting until today, Ministry of Natural Resources and Wildlife, Government of Quebec. So I think that's the order we'll go in terms of the speaking list. Am I set to go here? Yeah. So and thank you for coming as well, our invited guests to the Uninvited Guests Symposium. Again, what I'd like to discuss very briefly, and so we have lots of time for discussion, is the Upper North American policy context. And this is something that, one of the issues I've been working on while I'm here. Could you take that and pass it around, if you don't? Thank you. This is just a brief slide on bioinvasion and how we frame these issues. And I'm passing around an article I published last year on the topic. I cut it into different perspectives one can take. The typical take on this is that bioinvasion and invasive species in particular are a threat to biodiversity. And the international community tends to approach it that way, with notable exceptions. But clearly it's an economic threat as well. And one of the reasons we are so concerned about the Asian carp, of course, is the potential economic costs that would follow if the Asian carp made a successful invasion. You'll have to excuse all the military terms here, they're inevitable, into Lake Michigan. The zebra mussel and other types of mussels are definitely causing economic turmoil in the Great Lakes region. There are estimates of up to $1 billion a year, and the international costs of invasive species is tremendous. And Stas might have more to say about that, but we're certainly looking at in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And it's often overlooked that this is a very important trade issue as well, that most invasive species problems today are the result of transportation involved in the trade area. Doing something about them, in other words, can impact on trade relations. It can impact on trade regulatory processes, and that becomes an issue. It's also a very serious human security and health issue as well. Now, we can define invasive species in different ways. If we include pathogens, for example, then this is self-evident. But even in cases where you have invasive species that have decimated local populations of foodstuffs, you can see how it's a human health issue. Cultural threats, in some cases, some keystone species that are under threat from invasive species. This has an impact on the cultural activities and events and traditions of local populations, which I really view invasives as a community-based issue more than anything. The more research I do, the more I think it falls into that category. It's also become a major climate change issue. There's no question that climate change is exacerbating the invasive species problem. The primary concern here, I suppose, is that it extends the range, the habitable range of invasive species, aquatic and plant and all the rest. And so this has become part of the climate change debate. We have to do something about climate change because invasive species will have these subsequent economic costs and impacts on trade. Many would view it as a national security issue. And in fact, in my article, I do discuss this. There's a very interesting branch of literature that's developed that sort of takes it that way and questions it critically as well, whether or not there's xenophobic tendencies in challenging the quest to rid ecosystems of invasive species, for example. And finally, global governance, which we won't have much time to deal with today, but this is, I think, an integral part of the puzzle. And there are many organizations, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, that have an explicit mandate to deal with invasive species, and others like the World Trade Organization, which have a sort of peripheral mandate at this point in time. Canada and the U.S., we have many problems in common with regard to invasive species. I've already mentioned zebra and quagga mussels, purple loosestrife, Japanese knotweed. These are plants that really don't respect borders too well. It's hard to interview them at the borderline. The mountain pine beetle, many of you are probably familiar with this out west. This is just decimating the forest industry. And I can tell you an interesting anecdote about that. I do know that the Canadian government made a decision to go along with a settlement on our softwood lumber dispute with the U.S., based at least partly in the fact that we were very concerned that the pine beetle was destroying so much forest, we weren't going to be able to sell it if we didn't chop it down before the pine beetle got there. So it has a direct impact on interstate diplomacy as well. Mitten crab, West Coast, this is moving up from California. Climate change has a multiplier effect, as I already mentioned, on these issues, and in both countries. And that's something that is probably better recognized right now in the United States and Canada, at least by the federal government. Public awareness remains scattered in both countries. The Asian carp thing, many people view this as a godsend for people concerned about invasive species because it's finally front page. It's finally got a really cool YouTube presence. And I don't know if you've seen the YouTube, the Asian carp is quite a machine. But on the other hand, beyond that, beyond those brief moments of fame, this is not an issue that really is on the public radar, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do here, and I know Staj and others are trying to do internationally, is get it on the radar. That's a very important thing. We had, 3 weeks ago, I think, we had National Invasive Species Awareness Week here in Montreal. Did anyone know that?
Yeah, okay. Washington?
In Washington? Sorry, did I say Montreal? I'm sorry.
We know what you meant.
I just flew in the other night. Yeah. Okay, so, but yeah, most people didn't know that, right? And so that's an example. And funding, of course, the costs are tremendous on both sides of the border. This is a multi-level governance issue. This is not, I don't think it can be solved with vertical governance, with top-down governance. It can't be solved entirely with horizontal governance either, however, because some of the capital outlays, the infrastructural changes that need to take place in the Asian carp case will make this quite clear, are significant. We're looking at, probably over $10 billion to fix the Asian carp issue near Chicago. So I would say it's more of an adaptive governance issue, and I won't get into the theoretical details there, but political scientists have worked on this phrase. It's transgovernmental. I think you have more interaction that takes place amongst, let's say, Department of Interior, and Department of Environment Canada and so forth than you do amongst top levels of governance, of government, with an exception, though, which is very noticeable, I think, that provincial leaders and state leaders are often dealing with this issue. But also we have some binational organizations, which I'll come back to. Transnational policy networks, I think, are especially important. Experts and also social advocacy groups and private sector cooperation and self-regulation is essential here. And that's, I think, self-evident. Most of, again, back to the trade issue, many of these problems are caused by shipping routes and so forth. We have to be worried about cross-border train traffic, airplane traffic, believe it or not. One of the worst cases in history of invasion, the brown snake in Guam, was ostensibly caused by a military airport aircraft which brought in this invasive species, which has decimated the bird population and had severe cultural impacts on that island. So there's a lot of local action going on. First of all, it's important that the amateur factor, as I call it, that people that aren't scientists are as aware as possible of what invasive species are, which is extremely difficult to do. It's hard to teach taxonomists this, let alone to teach border guards, let alone to teach your average recreational fisher or boat operator. But nonetheless, it's essential that they report any sightings that they have. Reportage, local to national to global communications, monitoring. We have to learn how to share costs of monitoring the situation, and that's something Canada and the U.S. have to work on. There's some great examples of this. You know, the sea lamprey was poised in the 1950s to decimate the Great Lakes, and in fact, because of a lampricide campaign, lampricide is like a pesticide for sea lampreys. It was actually quite effective. It's still an issue, and it's still ongoing, but nonetheless, there was great cooperation there between local communities and the federal governments on both sides, although there has been some controversy. Minnesota gets serious. You can actually get pulled over by state police in Minnesota now and have your boat inspected for invasive species like zebra mussels on the hull of your boat. So if you don't clean your boat before you put it on your trailer and drive to the cottage or drive home from the cottage, you could end up facing some serious questions, which is interesting. I don't think I've seen that anywhere else, you know, where police have this ability. Corporate responsibilities, very integral, and First Nation American Indian communities, of course, are very much involved in this too, especially in some of the plant species issues, but also shared rivers. There's a lot of legislation that's been passed in both states. I'm not going to go over this in detail. The Lacey's Act is particularly important, of course, because it does prohibit certain imports, including Asian carp. Recent move to prohibit some of the snakes that have been terrorizing Florida and so forth. And Chapter 3 of Title 18, of course, is very significant, but if anyone wants more details about this, I'd be happy to discuss it. The National Invasive Species Council, I won't say too much about. We have two very fantastic people here that are on it. Essentially, it's a conglomeration from different American departments. In Canada, where provincial jurisdiction obviously dominates over most natural resources, nonetheless, we have many federal acts, and I list several of them here, which do impact on invasive species control, including at the bottom, Parks Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Environment Canada, the RCMP, and so forth. All of these are involved in border inspections, for example, and other issues. Canadian programs, a bit disappointing here, to be honest, at the federal level. The Invasive Alien Species Strategy for Canada was put out in 2004. It has not been renewed. It has not even been reviewed. I've spoken with the Auditor General for Sustainable Development, and he's assured me that next year he's going to try and place this as a priority. I think it's way past time that it gets done, but so far he's been unable to put it on the front burner, if you wish. There is a Canada ballast water program. There's an extensive interaction with the United States and ballast water and so forth. There was an invasive alien species, sorry for the redundant species there, partnership, which was taking place. The exact sort of thing that I'm arguing we need, where communities can work with the federal government, and there's a bit of funding involved to provide education, the sort of identification, training that people need, and monitoring and so forth. And this was killed by the latest budget, along with several other environmental initiatives and programs. Everyone's talking about the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy, which was also killed. But the Species Partnership, I think, it was a relatively small program, but unfortunately it was slashed as well, which I think was a mistake. But the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has a center of expertise for aquatic risk assessment as well. We have several binational institutions, the International Joint Commission being the most famous, the Great Lakes Commission. NAFTA has a Commission on Environmental Cooperation, which has put out reports on this and looks at the issue. The Great Lakes Fisheries Commission is very important. And then there's the Border Joint Action Plan, which has just come out, well, not just, but a few months ago, which I've looked at. And it has some room there for dealing with biosafety issues. In particular, of course, there's concern about mad cow disease and things like this, so things that have a direct impact on agricultural trade. There's pretty well nothing there about invasive species per se, so that's something that could get corrected in the future, however. Many policy and advocacy networks exist, including the North American Plant Protection Organization. The Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network has a very good reputation, I'm told. And there are several others, and I'm leaving many out here. But part of my thesis, I guess, and I'm presently writing a paper on this, comparing North America and Europe. What I think is developed in Europe, we have a much more of a governmental approach. Here, what we're really seeing is sort of a patchwork pattern of networks evolve. And many of them are transnational advocacy groups like these. That are having, and groups of scientists and experts that are having an impact on policy, but it's taking a bit, perhaps, longer. Global governance efforts, the Global Invasive Species Program I mentioned, it was funded from several sources. Funding dried up, combination of factors led to its premature death, in my view. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity, hosted in Canada, but observed by the United States. The International Plant Protection Convention, the WTO, I mentioned that. The SPS agreement does leave some room there for maneuver. And of course, the World Organization for Animal Health and the IUCN. All these are involved in this issue area to different extents, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that, or I think Stas is probably the best person to do that. The Asian carp itself, this was something we were discussing titles for this. And you remember the scene in Jaws, some of you will, of a certain age anyway, when they first approached and then this big, huge white shark comes out and goes back down, and then the one fellow says, well, if we're going to catch this thing, we're going to need a bigger boat, right? Well, with Asian carp, it's sort of like that. It's sort of broad-sided people. The size of these fish, their voracious appetite, it shouldn't have been a big surprise. You know, we've seen what the Nile perch did in Lake Victoria in Africa and so on. But nonetheless, yeah, we need a bigger boat. We've got literally, we need boats probably, right, to do a bit more fishing. But we also have I wanted to mention this, an electric fence, of course, has been put up. And there's a lot of talk now, if we could just pass this around perhaps, about how we can turn this temporary electric fence into a more permanent thing, reverse the flow of the sanitary canal near Chicago, a tremendously expensive project. What you're seeing there is a preliminary report that was put together. The Army Corps of Engineers will come up with a more final report. There are 3 options they're kicking around. We tried to get Richard Goss here, but he couldn't make it, who's Obama's chief person on this. The cost would be tremendous. But then I noticed yesterday, or Andy sent me this, that I guess this was a couple of days ago, it was in the news, that the electric fence had a power surge and actually was shut down for 15 to 18 minutes. In other words, an electric fence is great because it does repel fish, although traces of DNA have been found past the fence. But if the power goes out, an electric fence isn't too good, right? And this is what happened. So, as I put it, they had their 18 minutes of opportunity yesterday to make it through. The report says we shouldn't worry. There were only a few adults in the area, so I don't know what that means. But anyways, now I know that this is primarily. I'm sorry, I don't have a map here. Someone else might have. The Asian carp situation really only affects Lake Michigan immediately, right? Which is entirely within U.S. space. Nonetheless, the fear, of course, is that it will spread further if it does get out, much as the mussel situation. Zebra mussels more or less came from the east and have spread down south. So it's a case where you really need a sort of an adaptive governance plan. You've got Chicago is very much involved, of course. Illinois, Michigan, and the surrounding states are very much involved. This has gone to the Supreme Court, very complex case. Canada, our involvement has been understandably somewhat minimal, given the fact that this is more or less an immediately Lake Michigan problem. But I do understand that there might be some plans in the works for a more robust Canadian response, but that's not confirmed. The commissions I mentioned, like the International Joint Commission and so forth, all have secondary involvement at this point in time. And one question we might ask is whether or not an issue this important, this much significance to both states, should really become a new priority, for example, of the International Joint Commission. And would that have a positive or a negative impact on the outcome? So there's several questions I raised here for discussion. Excuse the old professorial habit. And in terms of transnational networks, I think they're very important, but they don't have any serious power at this stage. How can we better coordinate their activities? How can we better coordinate activities across the border, Canada, U.S.? How do you frame this discussion? How useful will binational institutions be? And how do you prioritize species action plans? I mean, who decides which species we act on? And what is the long-term view? Climate change and perhaps further conflict. I would say that in this case, we're used to talking about security in terms of some environmental issues like water, right? We've talked about, territory. We talk about shared rivers. We haven't really had a serious discussion about whether or not invasive species themselves, inadvertently, of course, it's not part of their agenda. They just want to survive. But whether or not they could have a deleterious impact on state relations, on relations between countries. And Canada-U.S., I think, will be, because we've got one of the most harmonious relationships on the earth when it comes to sharing resources. Will this test that? Will this become, and is the Asian carp perhaps embryonic here, will it become an issue that has to be dealt with? So I'll let it go at that, and we'll turn next to Staj. And would you like to sit here so you can?
Peter?
No, not at all.
Peter? Excuse me. Would it be possible to have the audience introduce themselves? Because I know that there's some experts in the field, so it would be nice to hear who's there.
Okay, yeah. If you
We can go around the table?
Sure, Peg, no problem. Why don't we do that very, very quickly?
I hope that doesn't disrupt the agenda.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Good morning, I'm Nancy Andrews. I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency and dealing with pesticides and endangered species and other things.
Thank you.
Good morning, Sabrina Dadrian, Canadian Embassy, Environmental Affairs.
Michael Gove, EPA, Vessel Transport.
Hi, I'm Meghna Desai with Northeast Midwest Institute, dealing with invasive species in ballast water.
Mike Trolson from the State Department, dealing with invasive species.
Caitlin Snyder, Fish and Wildlife Service, Endangered Species Program. Skylar Null, Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center.
Allison Winter, I'm a reporter with Greenwire.
Michael Nix today with the Leonardo Academy out of Madison, Wisconsin. We work on sustainability issues.
Peter Rose, the Governor of Quebec, Governmental Relations.
Rachel Kaufman, freelance science journalist.
I'm Cece Seifert. I'm a recent master's graduate student.
Hi, my name's Melanie Bateman. I used to be with the Secretariat for the International Plant Protection Convention, and right now I'm with the National Science Foundation.
James Sang, IBM Research retired.
Good morning. I beg your pardon. My name's Meredith Tenning. I'm an environmental history student at Georgetown University in my PhD.
Marvin Indolo. I'm with the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation of Department of Transportation, and we run the Great Lakes Ballast Water Collaborative.
I'm Adriana Muir at the State Department, where I cover aquatic invasive species.
I'm Kiwon-gon, scholar at Research Center here.
Okay, thank you.
Well, good morning. And first I'd like to thank Peter and the Wilson Center for inviting me to speak. And normally I give sort of a 20,000-foot overview, given my sort of broad federal focus with the National Invasive Species Council. But given that this is a condensed presentation, I'll probably be working at about 50,000 feet. And so I want to sort of touch on three major themes today. That's sort of the linkage with trade, which Peter has already talked about, the notion of pathways by which invasive species move, and finally scale. Again, sort of Peter has gotten into that, looking at sort of local, national, binational, as well as international. So trade and the movement of goods and people is generally associated with invasive species. And this slide here just gives you a general idea of trade flows across country. And just for perspective, and Peter had asked just for a couple of numbers, and people are always interested in financial figures. Back in 2000, Pimentel and a number of colleagues did a study in terms of looking at cost of impacts. And at the global level, they estimated that the cost of invasive species was about $1.4, $1.5 trillion, equal to about 5% of global GDP. And then when you break that down specifically to the U.S., and they did it for a handful of countries, it was $138 billion per year. And there are people who definitely have issues with these figures, with how these figures were derived, but just even being able to sort of put a figure out there to give you a sense of scale, I think is important. So, $1.5 trillion annually is a tremendous cost. And then you think, again, $138 billion, and that it's probably changed over the past 10, 15 years. The amount presently that federal agencies are spending on invasive species, and this is a conservative estimate, is about $1.5 to $2 billion a year. So you get a sense of what, sort of the magnitude of damages and then the scale of the response. And the one other thing that's interesting about particularly this diagram is you look sort of over on the left-hand side, but Canada, the U.S., and Mexico are right there. In a report that I worked on a number of years ago for the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, and this is probably stating the obvious, but it's useful, is that the major threat of invasive species to North America isn't necessarily a native species from Mexico invading the U.S. or Canada, but it's a species coming from somewhere else in the world, entering one of those three countries, and then spreading therein. It's not to say that a native species to one of the other countries couldn't become invasive, but the principal threat is coming from outside of North America. And this process of globalization, of movement of people and their either intentional or unintentional movement of species isn't new. I mean, sort of thinking back 2,000 to 3,000 years with the movement of Pacific Islanders, they brought rats and other species, spread them across the Pacific, moving into period of Western European colonization, exploration, numerous examples of deliberately putting sheep, goats, rabbits on islands as a food source, and then movement of crops and other things to make settlers feel like they're at home. So this process of movement of invasive species is hardly new in terms of human history. But the big difference is that when you look at today, the major modes of transport, and with shipping, roads, rail, and inland waterways, you can get to any sort of inhabitable place on Earth, and that means that invasive species can likely go there as well. So I want to get a little bit more into the linkage between sort of trade, globalization, and invasive species, and sort of the conventional wisdom is that a growth in trade will lead to an increase in invasive species. And thus, with the movement of more goods, both in terms of the variety of those goods as well as the volume of goods, would increase the chances for movement of invasive species. More importers and exporters within the global market means, to take a climate change analogy, you've got more sinks and more sources, so more places that invasive species can come from and more places that they might arrive in with the movement of those goods. And then finally, that faster transit times and pressures to process goods at borders will increase the likelihood that invasive species might survive the trip. And then the flip side, some would argue that there has been an inability or a failure for prevention efforts to keep pace. And even now, looking, for example, at the issue of forest pests, although our knowledge has increased in some of our regulatory and other tools, the number of introduced forest pests continue to climb every year. And reasons around that: lack of capacity, some would say lack of an environmental concern or constituency when compared to the fields of agriculture or livestock health. And then finally, going back to the 1990s with the World Trade Organization, there's sort of a chill factor, the question of if we regulate trade to stop an invasive species, will that cause sort of a dispute or a challenge within the WTO system? And I think we're moving on all of these fronts, some faster than others, and that likely depends on the country or the forum. But these are some of the historical issues that have, I think, kept us from reaching our full potential or the full need. There's also some unconventional wisdom in terms of some of the points that I just raised. And in fact, in some sectors, the risk of introductions may actually decrease with an increase in trade. And you think about sort of high-value products. Look at the cattle industry in terms of concerns about BSE and foot and mouth disease. They don't want, national country markets to be closed, so they've got a interest in making sure that their products are clean. Similarly, in the U.S., we're seeing with firewood that a lot of the firewood distributors are trying to set up a system where they can certify that their wood has been heat treated or fumigated such that it won't be moving wood-boring pests like the emerald ash borer or the Asian longhorn beetle. So there's an interest by industry in terms of sort of protecting their own markets and making sure that they still have access. Another issue that's come up, and this is particularly within the World Trade Organization, is that more rigorous national prevention measures put the onus on countries in terms of countries that are trying to export goods there in terms to meet those standards. And so some have thought and argued that this becomes a barrier for developing countries and their economic development. And then finally, when thinking about sort of economic scale, in some cases, working with the private sector may be more effective than engaging with numerous national governments. And if you think about, sort of the size of Walmart and its world presence in comparison to, a number of, sort of smaller countries, you can sort of see what the balance might be. And, it was a couple of years back that Walmart announced that they were going to take out wooden packaging in its shipping, and that has, a great benefit in terms of that those wooden pallets have been associated with the movement of invasive species. So that has a major impact on both sort of exporting as well as importing countries, and it also helps Walmart's bottom line in terms of they have more space within those ships to fill with goods. turning quickly to pathways, and these are the modes by which invasive species are moved either intentionally or unintentionally. Back around 2005, under the National Invasive Species Council, there was a working group which specifically set out to try to identify the major pathways of concern, and once identified, sort of turning to how do we look to addressing these various pathways. And they divided them to three major categories. So those that are transportation-related, living industry pathways, and sort of a catch-all miscellaneous pathways. Transportation pathways, some of which have already been mentioned, and I'm sorry that this is likely very difficult to read, but at the international level, you've got air transport, shipping in terms of ballast water, as well as hull fouling. There's also packaging in terms of containers and packing materials, shipping companies, the role that they play, and finally travel, tourism, recreation. I'm just moving through these quickly. On the living industry side, obviously plants, whether it's sort of the movement of whole plants, seeds, cuttings, soil, food pathways, live seafood, live plants, and then sort of non-food pathways, pet trade, bait, aquaculture. And then finally, on the miscellaneous, this effort looked at things like interconnected waterways, infrastructure, canals, things like that. One of the things that we're through the council, as well as the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, is trying to update this list. And when the original sort of diagrams were developed, the focus was on trying to figure out what is the relative risk across these different pathways and developing a tool to be able to do that kind of assessment. And I think now we're turning to, one, updating, looking at pathways that have emerged or taken on more importance over the past couple of years, and then trying to collate some of the guidance, whether it's regulations, whether it's international guidance, or work that states, provinces, or local stakeholders are doing. So the final couple points I want to make are on sort of reducing the risk associated with these pathways. And Peter already went through a number of the international institutions, and I'm sort of framing this slightly different. The invasive species span a number of different sectors, and so at the international level, by example, there are a number of international institutions and conventions that address different portions of the invasive species problem. So we've got environment, transport, trade, human health, agriculture, and the coordination across those becomes very difficult, and it's been historically a piecemeal approach. Some of that coordination is improving. There's now an international sort of group, a liaison group that involves the secretariats of many of these conventions and institutions that's trying to figure out where the synergies are, where the gaps are, how to develop synergistic capacity building efforts. And I think it's important to note that this, while I'm using this as the international level as an example, you can also see similar issues within, say, the U.S. federal government and the different agencies that are responsible for different issues. And so this replicates at different scales. And thinking about scales, I think it's also particularly important in terms of thinking about what are the relevant pathways for dispersal, and again, how do we respond to it either sort of in a policy or management perspective. This is a different sort of focus on the same issue of scales. And at the international level, with the World Trade Organization, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the International Maritime Organization's Convention on Ballast Water, they basically set up sort of broad policy frameworks such that with 100+ countries around the world or parties to those agreements, that those countries are acting in a similar fashion, addressing the risks in a similar way. And that helps sort of harmonize and facilitate sort of trade, movement of vessels, et cetera. At the regional level, and I'm thinking sort of by example here with North America, you've got similar sort of priorities, similar threats. It's many of the institutions are centered around coordination and information exchange. So the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, North American Plant Protection Organization, the Trilateral Commission. There's a number of bodies that do that within North America. The national level or the country level is really within sort of the state-centric paradigm, state sovereignty paradigm. is where the rubber hits the road in terms of border controls, national policies for prevention and biosecurity. And then moving down from the state into the local, it gets more and more specific in terms of looking at specific ecosystems. It can be trend setting. So on the ballast water issue, you've got California and formerly New York really sort of pushing the envelope in terms of ballast water sort of standards, and even getting ahead of sort of the federal process, and that becomes an interesting dynamic between sort of the state provincial level and the federal level. And then finally, the local level where the resource is actually impacted. The final point I wanted to make is in terms of thinking about pathways, that you can have one pathway and that might be sort of the vector for many species, or you have one species that might be associated with many pathways. So we've talked about ballast water. Just in the Great Lakes, you can see zebra mussel, round goby, spiny water flea, Eurasian ruff associated with ballast water, and that sort of story is a global story, as that sort of diagram shows in terms of relative number of invasions associated with ballast water. And then taking the zebra mussel, you can also see that it's native to Eurasia and was originally spread within northern and western Europe by canals, one pathway, brought over to the U.S., to the Great Lakes through ballast water, spread regionally through barge traffic, and then the bigger jumps out west were associated with trailered boats. And then on top of all that, you have natural spread. So you've got one species, but looking at sort of different scales within Western Europe, transnationally between the U.S. and Europe, and then regionally within the U.S., a whole range of different pathways that need to be addressed. And I think as we think through policy responses, whether we're looking at particular species or whether we're looking at particular pathways, we need to be thinking, again, what are the different pathways that are of importance, and at what level do we need to be thinking about regulating or mitigating those risks? So what we're doing at the federal level in terms of regulating ballast water might be very different than what's going on at the state level in terms of looking at trailered boats and movement of invasive species in that fashion. So with that, I'd like to close and again thank Peter and the Wilson Center, and we'll certainly take questions during the discussion period.
Slide over there. Oh, okay, great. All right, that's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm, I guess, directly from Quebec to tell you more about exotic species we have in Quebec, but also in Canada. Because it's a really short time period, I won't be able to talk about all the provinces, and I don't know all the issue in all the provinces as well, because I really work for the Quebec government. So you can see there is a lot of species we have in Canada, and they have issues all over the place. So I'm going to focus mainly on aquatic species, because this is one of the main issues we have in Quebec right now. But there is a lot of issues, especially in plants in the prairies as well, and in the west, in British Columbia. So are the issues more important in Quebec and Canada? First, I just ask you to look at both pictures, and if you would be a species, which place you think you'd be better to grow up. So I guess this is why you probably have more issues of exotic species in the U.S. than we do have in Canada, but we still have some, and so the limit of the climate is one important limit for most species that get into Canada. So they first have to survive to a latitude and to survive through the really cold winter. So it's the vegetation in Quebec, it's really not like you have here in Washington. So, but the issue we have are still important, because there's a lot of species, especially like the zebra mussel that's come from the Caspian Sea, that make a big impact. And with climate change, even in the north, so you see that the latest news in Nunavut, they saw some wasps, but they never saw it before now, and they thought it was a tour, and they were really fascinating about this species. But this is the beginning of exotic species spread up to the northern area of Quebec and Canada. So it's interesting to know that in Quebec, it's actually probably one of the first places where exotic species arrive in North America, because being one of the oldest cities in North America, you have all those plants and animals that were brought by the first discovered, like by Champlain. Today we have different boats, so they bring different species, and it was mentioned there's a lot of species that arrive in the Great Lakes and then made their way through the St. Lawrence River. So the guppies one, the zebra mussel is another one. So there's about 186 species in the Great Lake, and we now have about 87 in the St. Lawrence, so in Quebec. So all those waterways are connected, so all the species just slowly get from one lake to the other, or one river to the other. So I'm going to talk today about 5 different species, 5 different issues, so I won't be able to talk about everything, but just a quick a survey of different love. So the round gubby. The round gubby arrived in Quebec in '97, and it's really spread in 2004. It was really the beginning of having it all over the place. And what is interesting, you can see that this is a daughter. This is a similar species of the gubby in terms of niche, ecological niche. So it's a benthic fish, but the gubby reproduces much better. It's a much aggressive competitor. So the gubby actually replaced that species. So as you can see in the white, this is in 2004, before the gubby was really common in the St. Lawrence. And you see in 2009, the actual gubby replaced the other fish, the native fish we had in the St. Lawrence. So you can see that the gubby really changed the whole ecosystem and the ecology. And what you see in the bigger fish, like the predator of the normal dater, now eat about 80% and 85% of the gubby. So it really changed all the food chain in the St. Lawrence. And a preoccupation was that because the gubby eat a lot of zebra mussel, and zebra mussel filter the water, you may bring more contamination in the food chain than you would do with other species. So this is something that is studied as well. It'd be more interesting if we could eat the gubby, so they seem to do that in the Caspian Sea, but I guess we haven't had the market yet for eating gubby. I'm just going to talk about algae as well. So these are the didymon. It's an algae that's spread in the Salmon River. So this algae is really annoying because it really attacks pristine river. So you need a really high water quality. So this is the Gaspésie Peninsula where all the sport fishermen go for to get the salmon. So it's a really big industry there. And this actual algae will travel on the boots of the fishermen from river to river. So it's spread all over the place because of fishermen with their boots. And you can see the red dot. This is a really big proliferation, and then it's starting to be all over the north shore of the Gaspésie as well. So it doesn't seem to affect the northern shore of the St. Lawrence because the water quality is a bit different. But you can see the impact of the water, and this is normally the river you have there, so with the salmon fish there. And when you bring the algae, it really changed the ecosystem. So we don't really know yet what's going to be the impact of the fish. But of course, there's probably going to be one if you think about hatchery and all those issues. Asian Carp is a species very common here. It's spread. It was considered one of the most invasive species before the zebra mussel arrived. As you see on the map, you have it all over the place, but I don't know if I have a pointer here. Yeah, so this is the red dot. It's quite unusual because normally the species doesn't survive below 2 degrees centigrade in the wintertime. But this red dot is in Trois-Rivières, which is between Quebec and Montreal. And the reason we have it is because of the Gentilly nuclear power station that warmed the water in this area. So if you go in the canal there, this is about 10 degrees higher than the normal temperature in the St. Lawrence. So the population probably was introduced in some area and managed to survive there. But so we did some sample. We discovered this population in 2009. We did some sample in 2010 and in 2011. So you can see how before the density was quite low in 2009, but it managed to go further down and further down. So if you arrive in 2011, you can see this climb 6 kilometers down the power nuclear station. So this is the influence of the power station. And if you arrive here in the wintertime, it's about the same temperature than you have in normal St. Lawrence River. So if the species managed to survive in this area, it means that it managed to tolerate winter temperatures that are much below 2 degrees centigrade for most of the winter time. So it means that the species slowly may be able to introduce itself in the old St. Lawrence River, especially if we have climate change having milder winter. So just an illustration, the density in 2009 was about 300 individual per meter square, and in 2010 it was 3,000 individual per meter square. So this is a really fast progression, and I don't have the data for 2011 yet, but there's a really big increase in this density of this clam. The European tench, it's not Asian carp, but it's pretty cool because it's a big fish that have been introduced, and it's about the same way that it was illegally introduced. And this is a really good example that this guy, he brought 20 fish across the border, 20 really small fish in a box, and said, well, it was just for aquaculture and they didn't really know what to do with that because they thought it was for a live fish in an aquarium, and they just decided to let him go. And so we raised those fish, brought them in aquaculture, and they managed to escape in the Richelieu River, and then they colonized the St. Lawrence River. And so if you can see, this is a fisherman, this is a network we have with fishermen. When they capture fish, exotic fish, they call us and they send us a specimen. So this network have been going on for 2007. And we can see that the European tench, which is a fairly big fish, and it normally colonizes any habitat, especially those with low oxygen. So it's now found its way into Lac Saint-Pierre, which is, again, close from Trois-Rivières between Montreal and Quebec. So this is the number of specimens captured each year. In 2007 and 2008, no specimen was observed in the St. Lawrence River. And you see that last year, about 90 specimens were captured by commercial fishermen. So this is a really rapid increase of this population. And there's not much we can do about it because it's just starting to increase. And it's in the St. Lawrence River. So the control we have in the St. Lawrence River is really hard. And this is about 20 little fish that were brought over the border. And they were actually declared to the border, but they didn't know what to do with that. And by I think it's in the 90s that it were brought over. Just going to go quickly to water chestnut. So this is this plant produces about 30 to 300 nuts per year, and the nuts will stay in the water by about 10 years. So if you don't capture the plants before it do nuts, you have no chance to save your water. So this is low infestation, and this is really high infestation. So when we first found it in the South River in '98, we tried a reduction by hand. So you can see there the boat capturing the plants. So they gather about 6 million plants each year for many years, and then after 11 years of planting, it's almost gone. So this is kind of the success story that we managed to have this plant out of the system for now. So, but it's still not safe because there's so many seed remaining in the water that it can always break out again. So those are the species we add, and those are the species we don't want. So there's a lot of species in Ontario we still don't have yet. So the spiny water flea, we haven't found it yet in the water, but this zooplankton will change all the natural population in the water and then affect the whole community. So we hope not to have that one. Just also talk about the hemorrhagic septicemia virus, which we don't have, but it's spread all over the Great Lakes, so we actually don't know why we don't have it. But some of the regulation we'll do to have them is about controlling bait fish. So I'm just going to talk about this. This is a new regulation that started in April 2012, and now the importation of bait fish is not allowed anymore after 2012, since April. So no fish from outside Quebec can be imported for bait fish. And then after 2013, there's not going to be able to use live fish for fishing during the summertime. And after 2017, no dead fish will be used for fishing during the summertime. For wintertime, they decided to keep both fish alive and dead because seemed to change a lot of success of the fishermen. But this regulation is fairly new, and I think it's fairly in advance compared to other jurisdictions for that sign. About Asian carp and snakehead fish, up to 2012, we're trying to have the regulation, but now it's actually applied, so we're not able to transport, possess, buy, or keep alive any of those fish. So there's a list of fish, and Asian carp is in it, and snakehead fish too. So this is now a rule in Canada. So I'm going to finish on that. That collaboration will be very important because, as you can see, it'd be really easy if we could spot the exotic species that way in the border, but unfortunately, it's not possible. And I think we need to be imaginative because, as was mentioned, there's many ways exotic species can get into the countries and to cross border. And I would just keep this example because I always work on research on bat, and this is really worrying me because this is a speleologist that just come from Europe to study speleology, and he brought with him this little fungus on his boot and suit, and this fungus spread all over America now, and it's kind of decimates the most common bat species we had, and we never thought this species would disappear, but now the species about to was now called in Canada and the COSEPAC to be on the threat of disappearing, so which is a really big concern. And so you really never know who would thought that a speleologist would just decimate the whole population of bat in North America. So this is something that we need to think about because we never know which species will come and how it's going to come. I'm going to finish on that slide, which are some issues we do have in North America, and all those species are already present. But there's many other species that can come, and if we can limit the invasion of other species, it'd be a really good thing. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And was that the actual guy who brought the backbone?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
He didn't send me his picture because I don't think people really like him at the moment. So.
He doesn't want to show his face.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. And I want to thank Peter, the Canada Institute, and the Wilson Center. I appreciate it. It's a really wonderful opportunity to get a chance to see folks that we see in other meetings, maybe last week or next week or so forth, but it's great to see everyone all in one room. My name is Peg Brady. I'm within NOAA Fisheries, and I'm the liaison for the Department of Commerce as well as NOAA to the National Invasive Species Council and also to the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. We co-chair that with Fish and Wildlife. We probably, Stas and I and probably Anouk should have compared notes beforehand, so there's some redundancies, and I'll try to go through and skip over some of the slides that are somewhat redundant, but clearly very important issues that both Stas and Anouk raised. First, I want to, I don't know which way to go. I'm going to take a focused view more on the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force and the legislation. So it's a slightly deeper dive than Peter and Stas had taken. And just to give some folks some context, because I wasn't quite sure of the audience, and I wanted to make sure folks knew what we called ANS, or Aquatic Nuisance Species, and what that meant, because it's largely driven by legislation. And I think I'm supposed to do this, right? Or can I do it here? There we go. Great. Wow. Fantastic. We kind of waffle between ANS and AIS, so I just wanted to let folks know that aquatic nuisance species is actually laid out in the legislation that Stas had mentioned. It's the Aquatic Nuisance Species legislation that dates back to 1990 and then was reauthorized in 96, and I'll talk a little bit about this. But this is the outline. I want to talk a little bit about pathways, and I know we've done an excellent job of that, and talk about also the impacts. But more importantly, I want to talk about what's being done and some of the cross-connections that are going on here and some actions that are underway. Can everyone hear me? Great. This is the actual definition that comes from the 1990 Act of the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Nuisance Species Prevention and Control Act. And as I say, it was reauthorized in '96. It has not been reauthorized, and it certainly is due for some reauthorization. And this was largely driven by the activities and events that were playing out in the Great Lakes. And it's from this act that we formed the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, which is an interagency task force for the U.S. And also, it is also where the Coast Guard receives its authorization to develop the ballast water standards. And we just recently reached that national rule. It was released by the Coast Guard in March and is to take effect in June. So it has a couple of drivers in there, and I just wanted to draw your attention. But the other important thing to note here, it also, in the definition, many people think that we're just talking about plants and animals, but it also includes pathogens. So sometimes folks forget that, but that's, again, something to mention. Again, we're talking about species that are affecting not only the ecological stability, but the commercial, agricultural, aquacultural, or recreational activity. So it is broadly based. So I just want to, sometimes folks forget what we're basing our focus in on. We've talked a lot about pathways, and both the ANSTF and the National Invasive Species Council, which is a group of council of the somewhat similar agencies on the U.S. side, but we take an all-taxa approach there, whereas with aquatics, we're obviously just dealing with the aquatic, both fresh and marine. We've talked a lot about the pathways, and I just wanted to mention that we're now diving into some of these other pathways that we really haven't spent a lot of time on. Clearly, there's been a lot of effort with regard to ballast water. That's been going on for many years, and we're happy to say that the rule is out, the U.S. rule is out. The next big challenge, what I call the barn door that's still open in terms of aquatics, is hull fouling. There's a lot of studies going on both sides of the border. I know Peter mentioned CASIN, the Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network, which is a scientifically based network. Many of the universities and research centers across Canada are working on this issue, as well as on the U.S. and also in Europe. So the IMO has developed voluntary guidance associated with hull fouling just last year. Again, I underscore it's voluntary. But there has been a considerable amount of work. Actually, it was led by New Zealand and Australia. Naomi Parker was the co-chair or the chair of that group, and they did a fantastic job, sort of laying out a very guidelines for sort of husbandry of hulls. Well, actually, it's not just the hull surface; it's all surfaces that come in contact with the water. So again, I point that out that those guidelines are available on the IMO website, and I'd be happy to provide some information about that website if folks don't have it. The other thing that we just took up last week at the Aquatic Nuisance Species, we have 2 meetings a year, one usually out in the region and then one here in D.C. Last week we were hosted by our Mid-Atlantic panel, and I'll talk a little bit about the structure. But the Mid-Atlantic panel has been focusing in on the bait trade. We talked about, I was fascinated by the new regulation in Quebec. Is that just Quebec, right? Okay. The standard that's being applied up there. Bait is a major pathway. It oftentimes may not be the initial pathway, but it is certainly a pathway that extends the range of many species. And so I was fascinated to see by what Quebec is doing. The other thing is we are developing guidance with regard to recreational activities, and we've bounded that basically around the angling and boating community, as you can see with quagga zebra. The introduction into our U.S. Southwest was largely as a result of boat trailering. So again, we're trying to approach some of these more in a voluntary approach. Try to develop some guidelines based on some understanding of our pathways. Obviously, we just talked about that one, so we'll skip right over that. This is essentially the overview of the pathways that Stas had just mentioned. I just wanted to cite, typically it's been very difficult to assess not only the ecological impacts, but the ecosystem impacts. But Stefan Golosh, who's been doing an awful lot of work in Europe on this, has released some studies in terms of economic impacts, and with regard to aquatic invasives, again, my focus is aquatic. In terms of control, again, within Europe, he has documented about 1.8 billion euros. In terms of damage, 9.6 billion in euros, and a total of about 11.4 billion in euros. Again, that's just aquatics. We're not even talking about the terrestrial side. He presented these findings at the International Conference on Aquatic Invasives. It's again, I put a plug in for that. That conference probably will be held again in British Columbia. My understanding is it may be actually in spring of 2013, so folks may be interested in that. But that's a great opportunity to, again, get acquainted with many folks working on these issues, both on the management and the scientific side of this issue. These are just giving you a sense, again, this is not solely attributed to invasions, but this gives you a sense as to the aquatic species that are most imperiled, and this is from a Nature Conservancy study from '97. So it's a bit dated, but as you can see, the most imperiled fauna in the North America is largely in the aquatic realm, and clearly invasions can further impact the viability of these species. One of our colleagues at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is out at Edgewater, Maryland, and they hosted us this past week when we had our Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force meeting, is Greg Ruiz. He's a renowned scientist in this field of aquatic invasions, particularly marine bioinvasions. And these are estimates, or I should say results of some of his work looking at the coasts, basically East Coast versus West Coast versus the Gulf. And you can see clearly the highest impact has been largely on our West Coast, and it largely is a result of the trade routes to our West Coast cities. This is the scale, if you can't see along the bottom, is essentially a 180-year scale since 1790, and the number of invasions is on the y-axis. I think I can't underscore enough that the cost of an invasion, or the cost of doing the control and management, far outstrips the level of effort in terms of prevention. And this has been noted time and time again. But one thing I wanted to point out, we have a conference here every 2 years called the National Conference on Science, Environment, and Policy. And 2 years ago they had they looked at the issue of climate and environmental impacts. And we had a whole session on marine bioinvasions. And there were a series of recommendations from that. I think I mentioned that to Peter some time ago. And I want to draw your attention to those recommendations. They can be found on that site. The conference was held right here in this building, NCSC. And we had Dr. Williams and Dr. Smith and I'm trying to remember, I forgot the third panelist, but and Greg Ruiz as well, Dr. Ruiz, presented and came up with a series of recommendations, which I think are consistent with where Peter is headed with some of his recommendations. And I'll just cite a few of them if you don't mind. Prevent new invasions through a coordinated vector management and clearly articulate and evaluate the management goals. Second, develop monitoring programs across environments to document the distribution of native species, identify range shifts, and detect invasions. And I want to put a footnote there because we are working within at least the federal agencies on, and I'm thinking about a targeted approach on the Arctic. Clearly, the Arctic is of great concern from a climate perspective, but clearly, obviously, a high priority area when it comes to invasions as well. And Department of Interior and NOAA and a number of the other agencies around the National Ocean Policy Table, this is a new endeavor by the Obama administration, is focused in on developing what we call an ecosystem-based management framework regarding the Arctic. And it's still quite very much in its earliest stages, but we at NOAA have used EBM, ecosystem-based management, as an approach to take an all holistic approach to some of the stressors that may be affecting a particular area. But I see this as an opportunity for both countries to work collaboratively. And I know that there's been presentations made in Canada on this topic, and I think there's some real opportunity here. So I just wanted to mention that. Explore new innovations for early detection and determine the most efficient, cost-effective means of eradicating new biological invasions. Again, these are the recommendations from this panel from the NCSC. Improve public understanding of the problems and the impacts associated with invasive species. And I want to cite, and Anouk reminded me of this, we are seeing some great opportunities with regard to citizen science programs. And I draw your attention to the monitoring piece as well as improving public understanding. And I know Greg Ruiz is using this extensively through their CERC programs, the Smithsonian programs. All around the United States, he has looked at some of these citizen-based groups to help, particularly on his biofouling assessment work that he's doing. So I want to draw attention. I know when I visited with Anouk in Quebec, year and a half ago, when we had a joint meeting, I know that there's an awful lot being done at the citizen science level, and I don't want to dismiss that as a possibility. Obviously, implement research programs across a diversity of regions, and again, we're on the U.S. side working closely with Dr. Hugh McIsaac, who's head of CASIN, the Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network. He's based at the University of Windsor. They are doing some extraordinary work with regard to particularly genetics, and I see some real opportunities there for a collaboration between the United States and Canada. And I want to laud, I know that Peter sort of talked about the budgetary challenges in Canada as well as here, but I want to laud NSERC. You didn't mention NSERC in the list, but NSERC has been absolutely outstanding in supporting CASIN now for its second phase. And if folks are interested, I would really recommend taking a look at the CASIN website and the research that's being done by Hugh and his colleagues around Canada. I think it's a lesson we can learn here in the United States. And then finally, building partnerships, which is a lot of what we're talking about today here. This is just a quick analysis to look at sort of the stage of an invasion, the management options, which is the second column. The third column is really cost and efficiency. And then the final column is really the, at least the U.S. federal authorities. And it might be nice to compare your authorities, the Canadian authorities, in some of a model like this. And it shows really effectively, what options you can consider, the costs, and then obviously what we're talking about in terms of when an invasion gets obviously too far along. So early detection is obviously prevention, number one, and early detection. And that's one area where we're really trying to close the gap here in the United States. And that's really a funding issue and a collaborative issue, not only with within our federal agencies, but with our state and local partners. So let's just talk a little bit about what's being done. I've talked about this earlier on. This is the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. Many of those federal agencies co-chaired by NOAA and Fish and Wildlife. We are challenged, just like many other entities, with not a very good prospect when it comes to budgets. We do have some important gaps that we know of, and I talked about early detection, rapid response as one. But we also want to be able to focus in on key protected areas, and that's one of the areas that we're trying to close the gap on. This is the status report in terms of, as part of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, states are enabled to develop what we call an ANS state management plan. And the green represents all the states that have come in since the inception of this act. And in 2001, we had roughly $825,000 to support these states. Once they have an approved plan, they're eligible for dollars. In 2009, we only were up to $1 million. So we're looking at a 30% increase in contrast to the number of states that came into the program. So we had 10 states with approved plans in 2001. In 2011, we're up to about 35, 36. And this is obviously not keeping pace. So our pie slices are getting smaller for each of the states. Unfortunately, the president's budget that was released for 2013 zeroed this out. So the grants to the states are in jeopardy, at least for the next fiscal year. I'm not quite sure where the House and the Senate are in the process of debating the budget, so I'm not sure, quite frankly, if I'd like to think that they'll bring back some funds. The other unique aspect of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is this network of regional panels. And where I had met Anouk recently was our Northeast panel, the NEANS panel, met with the provincial partners to the north, and Quebec hosted us just about a year ago, actually. It was last April. And so we're already working across borders at the ANSTF level, and I think you'll probably see more of that happening. I know it's happening on the Gulf and South Atlantic with regard to lionfish. I know we're working with some of our territories and our international partners to the south there. So, but a lot is happening in spite of the federal government at this level. So I just want to laud the efforts of the regional panels. And these folks come and are represented at the task force and provide quite a bit of input at our task force meetings. We and I think I don't know how much more time I have here. We're okay? Okay, I just want to point out that the task force has had a strategic plan, and we have just revised it, and the task force last week approved it. It will be placed in the Federal Register this summer, and we hope it will be ready for implementation at the start of 2013. We've done a little bit of an overhaul from the original plan that we had, and these are the categories. If you go through the plan, you can see we have goal statements associated with each of these categories. And then what we're hoping to do is identify milestones and objectives within each of these areas that all the agencies, as well as those panels, can contribute to. So I recommend that you take a look at that, but that is a good model. And what we're now trying to do, at least at NOAA, is I have a meeting planned at the beginning of June for sort of an all-hands meeting for our NOAA staff to try to find ways to harmonize what NOAA is doing with regard to these goals and objectives that are stated in this plan. So I'm hoping all of my sister agencies will do the same. And then just quickly, I just wanted to point out, this is the good news story. It's been a long time coming. And the ballast water discharge standard has been a very difficult environmental and economic issue. And I laud the Coast Guard for its dedication and efforts. But I just wanted to give some context here. We're dealing with roughly over 100,000 arrivals in the U.S. Ports, both from overseas and domestic ports. We're talking about 50 million metric tons of ballast water a year from just overseas arrivals, and coast-wise, meaning within coastal areas, we're talking about 130 million. This lays out the importance of why we needed the standard. And then simply, this is just a simple overview. I apologize, I have proposed still up there. I was so surprised. Now I can strike out proposed and it's there. But it sets a concentration-based standard, number of organisms per volume of ballast water. It has an implementation schedule and application to the vessel and legal and regulatory exemptions. And it also harmonizes with IMO, but it does not disregard the possibility of extending to a more stringent standard, which is obviously what the states were very anxious to do. And these are just a couple of, I thought I'd just touch on a few things that we're doing at NOAA. We received some of these Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funds, and we have been targeting some of our restoration projects in NOAA in certain areas. And I should point out that we have set a special award condition to any grant that goes out the door. Restoration is also a pathway. If you don't know enough about the system you're working with, you may be bringing in something through a restoration project. So sort of a due diligence project effort on our part was we wanted an award condition in our grant award to ensure that folks are looking at the possibility of invasive species. And I recommend that other agencies consider that. And of course, lionfish is front and center for our researchers down in the southeast. And we have an internal action plan that we've been developing, and as I say, working with our federal sister agencies to coordinate our efforts and hopefully, certainly not duplicate our efforts, but we're certainly leveraging each other's dollars. And then I just want to draw your attention to another invader on the bottom. This is potentially one that may sort of be directly behind the lionfish in the Gulf. We have a tremendous increase in Asian tiger shrimp sightings in the Gulf, and it's quite uncertain as to what it's doing in that system, but clearly another system that may be impacted by a new invader. Again, it's growing in exponential. And going back to Peter's comment about trying to get the public's attention, I couldn't resist putting this one up there. For those folks who can't see it, the newscaster is saying, rumors of Charlie Sheen's boozy week-long benders with an Asian carp, details at 11. And the gentleman on the right says, it's the only way we can get the invasive species crisis on the American radar screens. So I just want to close with that. So, okay. Back to our places.
So thank you to all the panelists for great presentations. And I was particularly pleased to hear of who's in the audience, and many people with a lot of background. So why don't we turn it over and get some either questions for the panelists, or if you'd like to offer any insights yourself, we'd be especially pleased to hear them. Why don't we just open the floor? Oh, and please identify yourself. I know you already have, but maybe you could introduce yourself too. Yes, please.
I study environmental history, and one of the things I'm most curious about is... Oh, I beg your pardon. One of the things I'm most curious about and that I try to study is where transnational connections are made, and I'm particularly interested in the Great Lakes. And so, Ms. Brady, when you mentioned the regional panels dealing with the provincial governments, I was wondering if you could explain at all, how does that start? And what it makes that happen rather than, and what would, and there are so many cases where it could happen, and yet it's also very easy for any organization to say, no, that's too hard, we'll leave it go, we'll leave it be. Nice idea, no thank you. Yeah. So what made it happen?
I think I'll make a few comments, but Anouk might also have a few comments. No. They hosted the meeting for us last year, so there has been at least, well, let me take a step back. I used to be the director of coastal zone management for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts some years ago. And I know in Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire, we've always had a very good connection with our maritime provinces on the environmental front, particularly in the Gulf of Maine. I served on the Gulf of Maine Council for the Environment. And so there's been a long tradition there for some time on a range of issues. And the Northeast panel of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force has been mature. It's been around for some time. In fact, I think it organized itself before the federal legislation actually passed. And I know the Great Lakes group, I believe, was in place as well. So quite frankly, some of these groups organized long before the federal legislation actually passed. So there's a lot of maturity, a lot of institutional memory, and a lot of good relations already. So I know from my personal experience, those folks, we knew who to call in the Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And I suspect that tradition sort of carried on. And I know obviously in the Great Lakes that's the case, I know. So I think it just is being acquainted and knowing who to call and who might be on the other end of that line. And so I know the NEANS panel and the folks from Quebec got together and said, gee, let's do hold our panel meeting. The panels meet separately around the year, around the calendar. And so they hosted, Quebec hosted that meeting up in Quebec City a year ago. Mm-hmm. So.
I don't know how long Quebec is part of the NEANS, but I think it's fairly recent. I think it's a couple of years ago. But I'm at the government for the last 2 years, and I thought, no, it was a couple of years before me, but I think it's fairly recent that the collaboration between inter-jurisdiction, it started with professional level, starting to contact professional in different other provinces. For example, Ontario, we work a lot with Ontario, and but because we have similar issues. but they have a lot of program that started before us. So, but I think it started at a professional level, and then it get bigger with the panels and stuff. So.
What often impedes us is sort of our rules of engagement. For instance, I don't think in the ANSTF language, we can have non-U.S. partners, but even though they attend our meetings and so forth, we do have a spot for them, but we don't necessarily have full engagement. So those are the things, and also sharing of funds. A lot of times I know at the Gulf of Maine Council, we were challenged by sharing funds or putting funds on a particular project. So it's sort of the business rules that often impede us, even though the spirit and the willingness is there.
I think there's sometimes these things take on a life of their own, and I think we see that with the Great Lakes Commission as well, that involving Canadian partners was a natural thing to do, but it also makes a long-term sense in terms of adding to lobbying efforts made on both sides of the border. But you should never overlook the more basic fact, perhaps, that there are cases where efforts like this make certain politicians look good, and so they want to pursue it, right, at perhaps a local level and maintain it that way. But after a while, the interesting thing, I think from a historical point of view, is precisely the question you've asked: is when do these things become themselves and take shape? Sorry, who had? There was someone else with a hand up on this side over here, I think. No? Yes, please. Sure. Can you wait for the? Sorry, can you wait for the? Thank you.
I haven't had an interesting career in that I've been able to work for the Department of Interior and the National Park Service in the West, where most of my concerns as a biologist were with invasive species. And now I'm working in Washington on pesticide issues, where one of my basic concerns is making sure we're not destroying endangered species. And I guess that all of you probably have some of those same issues, and particularly with PEG, because those are many of your species are the ones I deal with. I wonder how you view that in a broad sense, because it's not an easy, often they're at opposing sides of the question, and lampricides are wonderful, but in other cases, 2,4-D's not so wonderful.
I think that the challenge of the pesticide issue has been a big one for the invasive species management community, particularly across the West. And but we do know that clearly early response and a targeted response is probably our best strategy. And in some cases, I know that unfortunately chemicals might be the most effective way to tackle that. Obviously, it has to be done in a very sensitive and knowledgeable way, but it's clearly one of the tools in the management community's toolbox, and so the recent rule has been challenging for the invasive species. And on the aquatic front, the challenge that we've had has been hull treatments, the chemical treatments to hulls, and the restrictions associated with copper and so forth. And clearly that has been a big challenge for the transport of the biological community that attaches itself to those surfaces. But I got to tell you, the industry has been really quick to find other replacements for those more toxic treatments. The good thing about the hull fouling issue is that clearly the industry very much wants to remove the hull, the fouling community as well for other reasons, because of cost and energy use and so forth. So that one we're aligned on and have been from the start. But so it is again, we have to be mindful that it has been a tool in our toolbox. So I don't know if Stas wants to mention.
Well, I was just going to add, certainly it's not an issue just here in the U.S. I've got colleagues in Mexico who are doing eradications across islands, and they're similarly running into difficulties in terms of the pesticides that they're allowed to use. And in Europe, I gather sort of the fear is that in a couple of years, many of the sort of tools, the pesticides and herbicides that are frequently used for invasive species control and management will be taken out of the toolbox. Peter was sort of mentioning, the question of biocontrol, which has its own controversies given the history of sort of failed biocontrol attempts. And these days I think there is still, there's definitely concern about it, and I think that's legitimate, but it's also useful to note that in many cases the process for assessing the risks associated with potential biocontrols, certainly in the U.S., are more rigorous than many of the assessments that are done of species that are just being imported. So what I like to do is just sort of, flip it back. Prevention is really where we need to be sort of putting our efforts, because hopefully in the longer term that will reduce the number of species that we have to eradicate or control.
Thanks. I would add that I know that biocontrol, this is basically using other species to wipe out invasive species, right? As that says, it's very controversial. It involves a deliberate introduction, and there's always serious concerns with that. Arguably, some of the worst-case scenarios that have emerged were really failed biocontrol efforts in Australia and elsewhere. But the science is really advancing now rapidly, and there's an organization called CABI, which is doing a lot of work out of Nairobi, and elsewhere. They've got scientific laboratories across Europe, and they've had some success with some pretty, I think anyways, challenging situations. So that's a possibility, but I think part of the problem is when you're talking about a large-scale invasion that we're seeing, perhaps well, certainly with the Asian carp in the northern Mississippi, but also with zebra mussel and so forth, it becomes exceptionally difficult to even talk about eradication, as an answer. And I guess all this does point back to prevention as to how important that is and fundamental it is.
I should point out on that particular issue, if we had a fascinating conversation last week at the task force meeting, just looking at those recreational guidelines that we were trying to put out there. And clearly a lot of prevention could be happening right at the citizen level. And clearly, you don't want chemicals being used at that point. But there was a fascinating conversation about temperature and quagga zebra. One of the recommendations was you should wash your boat down with 140-degree Fahrenheit temperature of water. And a lot of folks said, hey, my household water doesn't go up to that level. So, and where can I find 140-degree? So we had to pause on that and sort of come out with a more practical approach. And clearly, 140 is not something that we can readily expect an average boater to find. And if that becomes an impediment, then the rest of the guidelines aren't useful. So we have to think of some real practical ways and expand that knowledge base, particularly for citizens who are, oftentimes the transporter of many of these.
Would maybe add that it's interesting because there's new projects also that are produced and they have much more less damage than others. So, for example, in a conference, I heard that there's a product now that attack only zebra mussel and quagga mussel, and it's really specific and doesn't affect any other species because it just goes to the binder of this particular species. So those products can be natural and now work really well. But we did have to use some rotenone in some lake because at some point we decided it was more important to remove exotic species and let native species come back than actually kill the lake with exotic species. So sometimes compromise we must do.
And unfortunately, it's a real growth industry. If you're looking for investments, think about long-term invasive species control, because it might be worth putting money into it at this point. But, so, David, did you have a
question? Yeah, it's sort of a two-part question. One is on opposition to this. I mean, I can't imagine that the ballast water discharge thing, they came and said, oh, there's no opposition to it, that everyone said it's a good idea. I mean, could you explain some of the opposition that came into that? But also I'd like to talk about the budgets, because I think a couple of you mentioned budget cuts and how this is going to affect things, and how do you make the argument that it's worth spending when everywhere around us it's cut, 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 cut?
Just on your first question, it was a scientific challenge to determine what that standard would be. And the IMO identified a standard back now, I think it's 8 years ago, 6 or 8 years ago. A lot of folks were not happy with that IMO standard because they didn't feel it was protective enough. The industry was challenged, the shipping industry was challenged because of the lack of clarity up until recently as to what the U.S. standard was going to be. And they were just looking for a set standard so that they can begin to, obviously if they're building ships or renovating ships, they need to make sure that they plan ahead and have the right technology. So finding the right technology to reach the certain standard has been a huge mountain to climb for the Coast Guard and for the rest of the federal agencies that have been supporting this. So it wasn't that they were opposed, it was just sort of technologically and environmentally finding the right and appropriate level. There was also some inaction because of the challenge. There was court challenges as a result of the federal government's inaction, and that forced a couple of policy issues and just really sort of lit a fire under the federal government again. So it's been a range of issues, but no one has been sort of directly opposed. It was just trying to find the right standard that was technologically and environmentally and economically achievable. And then on the budget side, at least on the federal, we are definitely in the U.S. government heading into some difficult times. I shouldn't, particularly for the discretionary areas. And so NOAA will be challenged in FY13 as well as 14. But I think what it does is, at least from my perspective, it forces us to sort of work more collaboratively. I look at it as a forcing mechanism, actually, and find ways to work. If we just look at the A&S task force, find ways to more streamline and more cooperatively work together. And I think that has always been an effort, but now it's become more important for us to do that and try to successfully meet some of these goals and objectives we set out in this new task force. I have to say, I was a little bit concerned bringing a new task force strategic plan to the table last week, knowing full well that the state funds were in jeopardy. But I have to say that I think folks understand it now and know the challenges that we have ahead, but I think they're more galvanized, I guess, to work more cooperatively together than we would have in a flush time. So that's my opinion on that.
I was good. So 2 comments on the sort of the funding picture, and obviously there are sort of economists and academics and others who are sort of looking at sort of broader economic issues, and then there's sort of the day-to-day of both state and federal budgets. And one of the questions that I frequently get is, well, how do we best sort of communicate this to our policymakers? And the thought that numbers seem to be the most convincing. And I think gradually we're starting to get some of the evidence that doing things like risk assessments to look at species before they are imported into a country sort of while there's the risk that we might sort of forego some economic benefit for not bringing species in, over time we can see from studies that there is more of a payoff in terms of the potential costs in terms of damages that they do. And there have been some sort of groups and efforts, and this involves sort of industry stakeholders, environmental organizations, state-based players, particularly looking at the forest sector, where they've looked at rates of introduction, they've looked at the costs of introduction, and then sort of future trends and policy options, and trying to map across all of those sort of the history into the potential future. And I think that has been sort of very effective in terms of being able to tell a complete story, as opposed to many of the other, in the past, the efforts have been sort of piecemeal or focusing on this species or this particular issue. So being able to tell that entire story is helpful. I think that the 2 challenges, one just in terms of sort of budget cuts and programs, is one, consistency, because particularly with both prevention efforts as well as control and management efforts, these are things that are have to be invested in over time. And if you sort of work for 2 years trying to control eradicated species and then you cut the funding, that 2 years of work is sort of, it's almost worthless. And so being able to communicate that these are things we need to sort of maintain over time, and certainly the agencies know that, and it's figuring out how do we have the discussion with the policymakers. And then the final part of it is sort of on the prevention side, making the argument that you pay for what you cannot see. So, if you've done a good job of prevention, nothing's coming in, you don't see anything. And that's one of the hardest things to sell, I think. But again, certainly, many of the tools that have been developed recently, I'm also thinking that the USDA has been focusing on horticultural plants, are starting to sort of fill in some of the big holes. Peg mentioned hull fouling is still one of the ones that's outstanding, but if we can look at sort of the major pathways for introduction and get the regulatory processes on board there, then that hopefully will sort of limit the ups and downs in terms of the control management projects at the state and ground level.
I would just add to that, because the regulation is very important, and I think there's a lot of pathways which can improve the regulation, but I think the application of the regulation is also very important. And I know that sometimes this is something that is a deficiency, that there's no way of applying this regulation on the field. So I know right now the federal is doing a new regulation for exotic species, but they have no actual money to apply this regulation and just to check whether people actually transport exotic species, or even if you're not allowed to transport exotic species, if you never have anyone to really check if you have one or you do not have it, then it's not going to be very efficient either. So about the budget cut, I think there's an important budget cut in Canada as well. So recently, 2 weeks ago, we were announced that the federal budget for all the program of exotic species have been cut. So this was really important because all the little programs starting, so we use it for a lot of programs that started in Canada, and then we found finding by yourself, but the first year you needed this federal funding to start those projects, and so that had been cut recently, so we're not going to be able to use that. So I guess we're going to have to be creative of the way we found money to manage exotic species, and we deal with that. And it's really interesting that the way of calculating economically how much is efficient and how much it pays in the way to prevent exotic species, because it's much more economic to do that. And I think a good example we have in Quebec is the rabies, raccoon rabies that started to spread a couple of years ago, and they put a lot of money in the program because they actually demonstrated that it was more economically efficient to pay for vaccine raccoon than to pay for vaccination for the whole population of Montreal Island. So it was more economic to do that, and after 3 years of the program, they haven't found rabies raccoon since 2010 across the border. So they really eradicate the progression of the rabies in Quebec. So just being able to show that vaccination prevention and that way was efficient. So if we could do that for a lot of problematic would be useful, but it's a lot of effort to just demonstrate that it is economically viable to do prevention. So if you have to do that on every single issue, it's really time consuming. So that's the...
I certainly agree. Preventive spending is always a hard sell. Because again, if you're successful, you don't see anything, right? Although I would hasten to add that in a post 9/11 world, spending on counterterrorism hasn't exactly been curtailed by that fact, right? A successful counterterrorism approach is that you don't see terrorism. So, I mean, the precedent's there. And the other thing is, I agree, David, cut all around. But I think there is a difference between cutting back in a program, diminishing perhaps its impact, slashing spending somewhat, and actually killing the program. The latter, I think, does send, perhaps not to everyone, but to some people anyways, a bit of a symbolic message. That this government doesn't care about this program. It's prepared to let it go. Cut the budget in half, it's a forcing mechanism. As Peg mentioned, you'll have to do more with less. Okay, and people can live with that and adapt. But if you cut a program entirely, I think it does send a message, and that's where I have some difficulties with the recent budget. But other questions, comments, suggestions? Yes. Okay, Elaine, and then up here. Sorry. Please introduce yourself.
Alain Olivier from the Quebec office. A question for all the panelists. We touched on it a bit during the talk. Do you have any thoughts about, given the, I think the last slide on the last presentation showed that it's not so do you have any ideas on effective advocacy on invasive species at all levels, whether it's national, regional, as well?
Would you like to answer that?
Well, I can start. There's a program that started in Ontario, and I was aware of a couple months ago, and I think it's really good because it goes. It's actually a student that goes in the lake, and they have a washing boat station, and they actually go and talk to the fishermen and boaters, and actually explain them really why it's dangerous to don't clean your boat and to bring it to the lake, and how it can affect your success by fishing, and how it can change the fish population. And this is really a one person to one basis, and it's really time consuming, but I think it's so effective in a way that it can change the behavior of the people. And I think this is a new thing about social marketing, that we really need to find ways of changing the behavior of people, and this is all environmental issue are related to that. So I think this the way of talking to them directly and concerning what they really like about fishing and their fish, and which species they want and which species they don't want. So this is a way Ontario did, and we'll try to put that in, do that in Quebec too, because I think it's probably really efficient, and you probably don't reach as much people as if you do a big posting in TV, or example, or in radio. But the people you actually talk to, they're probably going to really change their behavior and then talk to other people, and so it's like a plant a seed, and this seed can germinate and probably change behavior. So for the local basis, I think it's probably one of the best way we can do that. So for higher authority, I guess it's probably more difficult, but it probably start from the basis and then it go higher. So
I think Anouk raises a very good model as the social marketing pieces. But with that, you also have to know a lot about the pathway. We have one model program at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA joined up with, and it's called Habitatitude. And what it targets are the pet customers. And so it's sort of a rules of engagement. How do you handle your pet, whenever you're purchasing at the store? And it's that material is supposed, I think they're supposed to post it in the pet stores. They're supposed to be on the bags if you're getting a fish, the rules of engagement, and how to handle the fish or whatever you're purchasing, and then how to I don't want to say destroy it, but sort of take care of it so it doesn't invade waterways. So you really have to target whatever the program or the outreach effort you do to the target. I think that's what Anouk is saying. They target it to boat owners and fishermen. This one clearly addresses pet owners or people purchasing in pet stores. And then there's a couple of other ones like that, but again, it's very targeted. It's not necessarily, sort of a broadcast message. And I don't think the broadcast message really is all that effective. I think really targeted social marketing efforts is probably the way to go. That's where we see the best return in terms of informing the buyers and so forth.
Just a couple thoughts on that, and sort of similar to the prevention message. It's sort of you're marketing something that's bad, and sort of going to sort of a very personal level. I think the key is for people, especially youngsters, in terms of having knowledge of native species, because knowing what is supposed to be around you or historically around you is then going to set the context for knowing what is coming in, what is damaging sort of your local park, your resource, et cetera. And there's a group called Rare Conservation, which does all of its work outside of the U.S., and they create what are called pride campaigns to sort of develop community-level conservation efforts. And we'd sort of gone to them saying, invasive species, it's an incredible problem worldwide. It's a problem in many of the countries that they work in. And these are experts on social marketing, communication tools, et cetera. And they turned around sort of after considering the issue, looking at it, having some of the sort of workshops and projects on invasive species. And their sort of method was to, again, focus on the native species. So look at what are the things that are being lost. So I think there's that baseline knowledge of what is it that you care for and that you want to see there. And I'd finally note along the lines that Peg was mentioning on social marketing, the Minnesota Sea Grant program has done quite a bit of work on this, doing sort of studies and monitoring behavior. And I think one of the key points in there is just letting people know that, yes, they can do something. This isn't a problem where they're just sort of the victim, but by washing their boats or taking care of their bait or something else, that little actions can mean a lot.
We have another question up here. Yeah.
My question's for you, Peter. You had mentioned a current study that you're doing between North American versus European approaches to invasive species, sort of bottom up versus top down. So I was just curious if you could share what you're finding with us and what standard you'll use for a comparison, given that, as all of you have mentioned, I mean, your main success is either fewer introductions or fewer invasive species overall, or more eradications that are successful.
Yeah, well, I'm not so much evaluating their level of success at this point. I'm just sort of looking at the structure that's there. And again, I find that the European Union is based really on the principle of that they'll decentralize things as far as possible, right? And yet it's a fairly top-down approach when it comes to these issues. Whereas in the United States and Canada, I find there's been a bit more of a vertical or multi-level governance approach that's taken place. Arguably, in Europe, you can look at Europe as a relative success story, but there still are some cases where they've got some serious challenges that they're facing. So, but it's really in the preliminary stage in terms of this is a paper I'm presenting in July, so we'll get to it by then, of course, and be happy to share it with you.
Commenting on that, I know sort of from colleagues in Europe, there's a great frustration in terms of the European market, and you could bring things in through Scandinavia, and it can come down to Spain. So it's very difficult in terms of setting up controls within a particular country. But I think, as Peter was mentioning, there is this advantage that they have the European Community government, which is now looking at a regional strategy, and they can definitely make a leapfrogging move in terms of, and they're reviewing what the options are right now of setting up a standard that would be, harmonized requirements for all the countries. So it's again this very interesting model where, while it might be sort of slower on the uptake, if they do something that's very progressive of, bringing almost that entire continent up to a higher level of protection.
Yeah, although there's an east-west issue too, and in terms of regulatory prowess and all the rest of it. Okay, so I think David's indicating we should thank our panelists, or did you have one more?
I just had one thing. I realized I know you had asked John Goss to join us.
Yes.
The Asian Carp czar for the United States. I did talk to his staff, and I asked them for a fact sheet. So there's a fact sheet from those folks here, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it earlier, but hopefully you'll get a chance to get them to one of these.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists, and thank you all for coming out, and good luck with things. Thanks.